It's exciting to be here together to worship. Thank you, worship team, for all your preparation, the work you do into leading us to the throne of God. Thanks also to everyone who helped set things up and tear things down and greet and run the sound and the computer, all to make just a smooth time of leading us toward God. So tonight we're in part 2 of a series called Why So Anxious? And since Halloween's over, I ditched the creepy Joker frown thing and switched it with a less stressful emoji. And we'll have that up there in just a moment. Missed one of the songs there. So we're talking about anxiety, and we don't have to experience clinical level anxiety to say that we get anxious. If you ever feel worried or fearful or apprehensive, bothered, nervous, impatient, stressed, all of those apply to the anxiousness that we're talking about in this series. So whether anxiety seems to plague you just about every day or whether it only comes sometimes, I think we can all agree that it's something that every one of us experiences in our culture today. And this series is about what we can do with that anxiety. So sometimes there are things we can do to change the situation that's causing us anxiety. Like if I'm anxious about all the work that I have to do, I could procrastinate and make my anxiety worse. Or I could get my list out of my head, put it on paper, put it in an app, and start working on it, which will reduce my anxiety. So sometimes we can change the situation that we're anxious about, but sometimes we cannot. Sometimes there's not anything we can really do about the situation we're anxious about, but we can still do something about our anxiety by surrendering it to Jesus. Last week we learned that anxiety is our signal to pray. Anxiety is our signal to pray. Talked about last week, check engine light on your car. When that comes on your car, the little light on your dash isn't the problem. It's the signal that there is a problem and that you should take it to a mechanic who can fix it. It's the same way we can view our anxiety as that check engine light. And then when we have the anxiety, that's our signal to take it to the one who can fix it, who is Jesus. And then we drop it at his feet and let him change us, even if he doesn't change the situation we're anxious about in our preferred timing. For tonight, we're going to start with the same passage as last week. It's Philippians 4, verses 4 through 7. And you're welcome to turn to it. I'm going to have it up on the screen this week. Philippians 4, verses 4 through 7. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Let your reasonableness, that is your gentleness, your patience, be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand, meaning Jesus is near. He's with us. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And you can say that, you can sing it, you can shout it, sigh it, write it, just express it and surrender it to God. Verse 7, the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. So rejoice in the Lord always. Always? Really? Rejoice when you're worried about losing your scholarship? When your significant other lies to you? When you're one strike away from losing your job? When you feel rejected by your friends? When a loved one has a medical emergency? Not to trivialize any of that, but yes, rejoice in the Lord always. We're not told to rejoice in the circumstance, told to rejoice in the Lord. Rejoice in Jesus. And that's so important. We don't rejoice in the what, we rejoice in the who. We don't rejoice in the what, we rejoice in the who. The Apostle Paul wrote this passage So we might think, well, it's easy for you to say, Paul. I mean, it's a nice sentiment, but you don't know what I'm dealing with. Well, actually, it wasn't easy for Paul to write this in what we think of as easy. He wasn't all cozy by a gas fireplace with his books and his latte. He wasn't wealthy and successful in the world's eyes. He wasn't soaking up the sun on some Mediterranean beach. He wrote this letter to the church in Philippi from prison in Rome. And inspired by the Holy Spirit, after he'd been beaten up and left for dead many times, after he'd been shipwrecked, not once but 3 times, even while he was locked up in prison, he wrote for us to rejoice always, to not be anxious about anything. How could he write that? How could he ask others to choose that? Well, it's a matter of perspective, which is what our focus is tonight. With a natural perspective, I'd call that the perspective of pain. Paul might have had thoughts like this. When he's sitting there in prison, he might have thought, my dreams of preaching the gospel all over the world are gone. I'm stuck here in chains. I can't sleep. I can hardly breathe. This place is a nightmare. That would be the perspective of pain. But instead, Paul maintained a perspective of praise. He might have thought, I didn't really see this when I was arrested, and I was tempted to think bad about the situation, but listen to this. And earlier in his letter to the Philippians, Philippians 1, verses 12 and 13, he writes this. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me, has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard until all of the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. So just imagine a little twinkle in Paul's eye as he's dictating this to a scribe while he's in chains in a prison. Paul says, yep, visiting Rome wasn't all it was cracked up to be. It's no 5-star resort, but they've actually chained me to Roman guards. And these guys report to very influential people. And when they change the shift every 8 hours and send someone new, I've got a captive audience to tell them all about the gospel of Jesus. So who's the real prisoner in this situation? Rejoice in the Lord always. Do not be anxious about anything. Give it to God. This wasn't Paul's first time in prison either. The first time was actually in the city of Philippi. Acts 16, verses 11 through 40 tells the whole story of Paul's experience in Philippi. Let me summarize it, most of it. Paul and Silas hadn't been in Philippi very long, so they basically met one family, and it was the family of a businesswoman named Lydia, who she and her family became Christians because Paul and Silas preached the gospel to her. And so Paul and Silas were on their way to a nice place to pray by the river one day, and this was actually the place where they had met Lydia. And they met a slave girl who was possessed by a demon. And through the demon, this girl brought a great profit to her owners because she was a fortune teller. So she would tell people's fortunes, predict the future, and her owners would make a lot of money from that. And she started following Paul around and proclaiming, these men are servants of the Most High God who proclaim to you the way of salvation. It was true. Well, not a bad thing. It's kind of weird that a demon would be shouting that through this girl, following them around. And it wasn't bad, but it annoyed Paul so much that at one point he just turned around and cast the demon out of her in the name of Jesus. And so when her slave owners realized their source of income was gone, they basically started a riot, beat up Paul and his companions, and the officials threw them in jail without any investigation, without any trial. So this is the same Paul who later wrote for us to rejoice in the Lord always. So we're going to read verses 25 through 28. It says, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. Wait, what? They're in prison. They were wrongly accused. Their faces are swollen. They got blood and dirt everywhere. And Paul's like, hey, Si, you awake? Hey, you awake? Let's sing that new Hillsong United song. So, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken. Immediately all the doors were open, and everyone's bonds were unfastened. When the jailer woke up and saw the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried out with a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." So, you, just imagine, you and your companions are unjustly thrown in prison. Then suddenly there's a miraculous earthquake which opens everyone's door and loosens everyone's shackles. Who's staying in their cell? Anyone? No? What kind of person stays in their cell when that happens? Someone who believes that his purpose wasn't finished there yet. Paul's like, I'm not leaving. We're having worship night here. And he knows that all the other random prisoners who were in jail with them, they were listening to Paul and Silas, they hadn't left either. So God was starting to do something there in that jail. And so Paul and Silas decided to stay until God's work was finished. And the jailer was freaking out. Obviously, he'd never experienced anything like this God that they were singing about. And so he asked Paul and Silas, how can I be saved? And so he gathered his family together. Paul and Silas shared the gospel with his whole family. And the big jailer washed their wounds. And then the missionaries got to baptize their jailer and his whole family. And then they celebrated with food, which is always a great idea. Right, Connie?
Yes.
Then by morning, the city officials decided that they were going to let Paul and Silas go. So the jailer and his family became Christians because Paul realized that God was moving even in the midst of his suffering. The jailer's family and Lydia's family, mentioned earlier, would have been the founding members of the church at Philippi, the church whom Paul was now writing a letter to from a Roman prison, which is kind of ironic. But what can we learn from that? We can choose a perspective of praise when we trust that God can find a purpose. We can choose a perspective of praise when we trust that God can find a purpose, even in the most horrible situation. James, who is the author of the book of James, shared a similar message. The Bible sometimes has repeating names of different people, kind of like Maddie here right now. So there's multiple Jameses, and this was not the Apostle James, who was one of the 12 disciples. The author of the book of James was the half-brother of Jesus. He was the son of Mary and Joseph. So if any of you ever struggled with rivalry or comparison with a sibling, just imagine if Jesus was your big brother. You know, the only perfect child. You know, terrible twos, you know, what's the big deal? Early teen years, no sweat. You know, Mary and Joseph must have thought they were outstanding parents until James came along. James, again, why can't you be more like your brother? And later on in life, when Jesus abandoned the family carpentry business, started wandering around like a nomad, saying all these weird things, wasn't taking care of himself with proper food and rest, started to gain this eclectic following of fishermen and tax collectors and zealots and prostitutes. There was a point when Jesus' family, including James and even including Mary, literally thought that Jesus was crazy. Mark 3:21 talks about that. But in time, James, the son of Mary and Joseph, trusted his brother for salvation, became a leader of the church, and he eventually was martyred because of his faith. That means he was murdered because of his belief in Jesus. So James is no wimp when it comes to hardship either. And just like Paul chose a perspective of praise because he trusted God could find a purpose, James writes this, James 1, verses 2 through 4. Consider it a great joy, my brothers, whenever you experience various trials. Again, what? Joy when we experience trials. Notice it didn't say if you experience trials, it said when. Consider it a great joy, my brothers, whenever you experience various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And that Greek word there for endurance actually has the connotation of cheerful or hopeful endurance, which we don't even have an English word that I'm aware of, like a single word that describes that concept. Cheerful endurance kind of sounds like an oxymoron in our culture. Verse 4, but that cheerful endurance must do its complete work so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. And don't think of that word complete there as finished, as in you're not going to grow anymore, it's all done. Think of it as whole. You're a whole person. So James says that the testing of our faith, those trials and disruptions that usually produce anxiety, can actually produce cheerful, hopeful endurance. How? Why would that happen like that? We can have cheerful endurance because we know it's on its way somewhere. The trial isn't the end goal. The endurance isn't even the end goal. The destination is that we will be mature and whole, a step more like Jesus. And that's a goal that I can get behind, to be more like Jesus. If I'm facing a bad situation and my choices are anxious survival or path toward wholeness, if I can, I'm going to try to go for the path toward wholeness when we lay it out like that. Whatever the trial, whatever the disruption, I can build hopeful endurance through it rather than anxiety, because I believe God's doing something in me. He's bringing me somewhere through that experience. Well, obviously that's not always the case. Sometimes we do have a lot of anxiety. We barely survive our disruptions. So what makes the difference there? The beginning of James's paragraph tells us the key. The disruption can actually bring us somewhere instead of pull us back if we consider it joy. Notice he didn't say it was a happy occasion. He didn't say it was a joyful situation. He said, consider it joy. Consider it joy because you know God can do something through this bad situation. Consider it so. Count it as such. This isn't the natural line of thought, but lead yourself to believe this. That's what he's saying. Like in Philippians 2, verse 3, Paul told us to count others as more significant than ourselves. It uses the same verb there, to count as. The kingdom of God, we're all on the same level playing field. But Paul was saying if we consider that, if we treat others as more important, that's going to help us have a humble attitude and an attitude of serving and caring for others. In Hebrews 11:11, it says that Abraham's wife Sarah, even though she was decades past childbearing age, God promised that she would have her own child. And there were definitely some speed bumps along the way. Even though her natural line of thought was screaming the opposite, she led herself to believe, and she considered God faithful to fulfill his promise, which of course he did. So James is telling us this won't be our natural line of first thought, but again, we can choose a perspective of praise when we trust God can find a purpose. See, Paul saw God's purpose for him to share the gospel. James saw God's purpose for him to grow in maturity and in wholeness. Those aren't the only two options of purposes that God could have for our trials, but they're great examples of purposes that God might find through our trials. Remember, we're not rejoicing in the what, we're rejoicing in the who. And he can take a horrific situation and do something good as we walk through it with him. When we actually do that, there's a pretty cool byproduct. Is that we'll build endurance for the next trial. We're going to keep having trials. That's not going to stop. What do I mean by that? Think of that endurance for trials, our ability to bounce back after a disruption in our life, as our resilience. So the greater our resilience, the smoother and faster we'll move through a disruption of a certain magnitude. If I can't successfully navigate the level 2 disruption I'm facing today, how am I going to navigate the level 4 disruption I'm going to experience next month? Or the level 7 disruption I'm going to experience next year? Little kids have incredible natural resiliency. As we become teenagers and adults, a lot of that goes away. But James is telling us how we can build it. When we experience one of those trials or disruptions, instead of fighting against the pain, we can welcome the resilience that God will build in us. Instead of fighting against the pain, we can welcome the resilience that God will build in us. Actually, we've got a slide for that one. The natural instinct is to try to avoid the pain. Put it off, not deal with it, leave everything unresolved, try to move on by stepping around it. But instead of fighting against it, instead of avoiding it, we can choose a perspective of praise in Jesus because we trust he's going to do something better. And we can face it head on. Do any of our camp people know that going on a bear hunt thing? Like, I don't even know, it's not a song, it's not really a chant, I don't know what to call it, but does anyone know that going on a bear hunt thing? Yes. So can you help me out? What's the main line when you face various obstacles? You can't go
over it. Can't go under it. You must go through it.
Must go through it. Maybe you can do some motions later. You got to go through it. When we choose to rejoice in the face of anxiety, we're not neglecting our responsibilities and deadlines. Oh, I've got this big paper that's making me super anxious, so I'm just going to praise Jesus. It doesn't work like that, because then you're just adding more anxiety for later on. When we choose a perspective of praise, when experiencing a major loss, and we don't avoid grieving that either. As we grieve, we can still choose joy. We can have those at the same time, which is kind of a weird thought. We can choose joy that God will build hopeful endurance through it. Maybe God will open an opportunity for someone to learn about Jesus because of this. Maybe God will bring us out the other side of it as more of a whole person than I was going into it. And maybe he'll give us the opportunity to comfort someone else who will go through something similar after us. But you got to go through it. We don't choose a perspective of praise by avoiding the situation. We choose it by walking with God through it. Trusting that he can work out a good purpose. We can focus solely on the situation and have that perspective of pain, which is surely going to add to our anxiety. Or we can focus on Jesus through the situation, choose a perspective of praise. It's a choice of perspective, and it helps to ask the right questions. Instead of asking, God, why is this happening to me? We can ask, God, what do you want to do in me or through me? Instead of asking, why is this happening to me? Ask, what do you want to do in me or through me? It's all about perspective. Last week we said that anxiety was our signal to pray. Well, this week, Anxiety is our signal to praise. This summer and last fall, this summer and into the fall, I was in a lot of pain and discomfort because of my surgery. And it was a huge disruption from my normal summer, from the normal beginning to the fall semester. And I was tempted with a lot of anxiety. I experienced quite a bit of anxiety. But I'm pretty sure I experienced a lot less anxiety than I could have because I knew God had some purposes behind my surgery. Obviously, the most straightforward ones, I went through the surgery so that I won't have heart problems later on in life. That's why I had the surgery. Another one was that I went through the surgery with the hope that my physical endurance come this January I'll have a greater capacity for that than I did this past June. And we'll see when I get there. But through my surgery, the Cooks and the Shooties got to plan our leader retreat, which is a cool experience for them. Because of my surgery, some friends came alongside me to do 4 of the first 5 messages of the semester, and I was very blessed by that. And if you were here at the beginning of the semester, because of my surgery, you got to experience that variety of different people at the beginning. Because of my surgery, I can have compassion on my friend Aaron from church, who just experienced open heart surgery last week. And so a handful of months ago, I wouldn't have been able to relate to that. I wouldn't have been able to have that compassion for that. It was a horrible experience in and of itself, but through it, God did some pretty awesome things. And definitely not perfectly, but for the most part, I tried to choose the perspective of praise, which lowered my anxiety compared to where it would have been. I knew God would use it, but I didn't realize how much He would use it and all the different ways He would use it until afterwards, and I saw those later on. Looking back, I can even say that I rejoice that I had a sinus infection in April, because that's what brought me to the doctor's office, where they discovered there was something off with my heart. Sinus infections aren't very fun, pretty miserable, but I can rejoice that I experienced it because God had a purpose for it. We don't rejoice in the what, we rejoice in the who. We can choose a perspective of praise when we trust God to find a purpose in it. Instead of fighting against the pain, we can welcome the resilience that God will build through it. And we don't choose a perspective of praise by neglecting the situation or avoiding it. We choose it by walking with God through it. And all that is going to lower our anxiety. Let me pray. God, thank you for tonight. God, I thank you that even though the world looked so different 2,000 years ago, that you gave us some instructions for something that really applies to us today with anxiety. God, we thank you that you work for our good, and we live in this fallen world that we messed up, that there's natural disasters and our stupid choices and other people's stupid choices. And even though you allow that for the sake of our choice in choosing you can use it, and you can work good through even the most horrible situations, God. And it's not fun to experience those, but God, we're glad that you can find a purpose through it, and you can use us in different purposes through that, God. We thank you. God, I pray as we continue in this semester, as the papers and exams and studying for those start to build back up again over the next few weeks, God, help us look to you to reduce our anxieties, not put things off, or if we've got other issues, God, emotional issues with other people, God, help us not avoid those, but walk through those with you and just see what you do with those. God, we thank you for this time. I pray this in Jesus' name, amen. So like last week, we're going to do some discussion questions just to process this a little bit. And maybe give it 5 to 10 minutes of doing this. We're find a person you know, and then the two of you find 2 other people that you may or may not know. And make sure you get everybody's names. And then we've got these questions for there's some follow-up questions, but 4 main questions. And we don't have time for everyone to share everything about all those. So remember, paragraphs, not pages, in what you share. And you can kind of pick the question that is begging you to answer it. And so we'll have time to move through that. And when we start worship, if you didn't get through it, continue the conversation later on tonight. So go ahead and find someone, and then the 2 of you find 2 others, and start working through the questions.